Alien Romulus, another entry into the somewhat marked legacy of the Aliens franchise. And just like the Romulus and Remus in the ancient mythology before, this movie has committed a fratricide in what could have been a faithful follow-up from Aliens by Neil Blomkamp, and come forth as the victor with a new direction for the series. But this time we got Romulus and the Funky Bunch. The eponymous Romulus, named for its mythological ideas of beginning a new era for humankind. A subtle play on the ubiquity of the Weyland-Yutani Company and its ostensible innovations attempted through the designs of the Renaissance Station. This movie was directed by Fede Alvarez, a Uruguayan director that has spent most of his career directing horror and suspense thrillers, making him an apt choice for the Aliens installment. This film had a budget of about 80 million quatlus, and as of this moment has grossed over 300 million quatlus at the box office, which is a pretty solid performance and actually out-earning Ridley Scott's last entry. I'd say Fate did a pretty good job managing the budget that he had, and from a purely aesthetic perspective, he's done a fantastic job at conveying the ideas and themes from the first two Aliens movies into a more contemporary picture. So before a complete deconstruction, a quick summary of the plot. It's a collection of miners with ambitions of planetary relocation. A motley crew decide to take advantage of some cryopod fuel cells that have just been discovered on a derelict space station floating above the planet's orbit. This would allow them to escape the novel diseases and other medical woes that are being caused by the mining process. Rain and her synthetic companions seek to live in a world where they can see the sun. This is called Yvaga 3. Anyways, this gets the crew motivated enough to go second to the fuel and make the 9-year journey to this non-Weyland-Yutani controlled world. The rest I'll get into in a moment. It's not the most ambitious story, but as we know from Alien and Aliens, sometimes the simplest plots tell the best stories. I mean, good versus evil is a basic premise in itself, so it's not as lofty and pretentious as Covenant or Prometheus were, which we can all take as a kindness, but it's not as easy to connect to as it was with the first two films. There is an aspect that's missing, some ephemeral quality that's just absent in this movie. With Alien, you were really endeared to the crew, so their struggles against the xenomorph felt impactful. In Aliens, you were aware of the gravity and severe consequences of what was going to happen to the colonists because of the first film. It's also helped by the fact that Ripley is such a strong protagonist. The challenges that she faced and sacrifices that she made during the first film really makes all her character qualities and personality traits well earned throughout the second film. It's the fact that she has to put herself back into harm's way in an attempt to try and help the colonists, as she is the only one with any real insight into how the xenomorphs behave. In a bid to overcome her crippling PTSD and anxiety, she is willing to go back into this hell with the Marines to try and confront the species and rescue any survivors. This is what good stories are made of. You have a character arc that organically spans more than one film, that is appropriately motivated due to a realistic sequence of events, and makes decisions and exhibits behaviors based on past experiences. You feel anchored to Ripley's struggles and you root for her the entire film. Combine this strong character foundation with the introduction to a new group of ragtag individuals such as the Marines, all with unique idiosyncratic behaviors and personality quirks, and you have a likable ensemble that you actively want to see succeed in their endeavors. The fact that the Marines are so incredulous to the potential threat and severity of the situation that they are willingly entering into, consumed by an overconfidence of their abilities, they act with such entertaining nonchalance and disregard to the level of seriousness that their job requires at this moment. It only takes a handful of scenes and a few minutes of actual screen time for you to really see the rapport developing between the cast. And you, the audience, begin to nervously anticipate their encounters with the xenomorphs. The casual nature of the Marines is also really well complemented by the serious characters of the film. Ripley, who's traumatized by her experiences, who knows exactly what they're going into. The synthetic Bishop, who's really armed with logic and reason over everything else, so he's not really that entertained. And the aspiring new lieutenant who's desperate to prove himself in the field. These character dynamics and the interpersonal relationships that you observe in the film is exactly why you care about them. So Romulus does try and take a page from the playbook of Alien and Aliens regarding their character composition. It's a well-meaning attempt to mimic the qualities that made the first two movies so engaging, but unfortunately it doesn't quite have the same impact as we would have hoped. And so before I get started on the main review, I want to preface this breakdown, analysis, review, retrospective, retrograde by stating that this movie, in my opinion, is significantly better than every other movie since the second Aliens was released. I don't think it elevates the IP in any major way, nor does it return the franchise to its original form, the way a property like Alien Isolation may have done, but I do feel like it has reminded the audience that there is still ideas worth pursuing in this universe, and they can be engaging and providing enough to inspire further exploration. Romulus was primed to be the cinematic rebirth of a franchise in dire need to return to its roots, and there was so much hope for it, but ultimately this movie was some style and not a whole lot of substance. It has individual moments that provoke a familiarity of the first entries, but it ultimately feels absent of the character that made the original so unique and so well loved. Very quickly you realize that subtlety is not the intended modality of this movie, and it has a variety of flaws and plot contrivances that make it difficult to hold in the same regard as its predecessors. And by them I mean 1 and 2. None of the other garbage. So the movie opens in a scene reminiscent of the first Alien, with a ship's central AI computer switching on after being alerted to an unknown signal of some kind. The visuals of the ship's cockpit really drive home that retro-futuristic style and presage the aesthetic that will dominate throughout the movie. It's a much welcome return to that functional and industrial style which always felt more at home in the Aliens universe, which was grounded in that working class and gritty realism. The monitors and neo glow across all the instruments look brilliant, really similar to some of the visual themes in Isolation. Things are a bit more emphasized and stylized compared to the first and second Aliens, but it's not an unwelcome style. It's still a high contrasting aesthetic that adds rich texture to the scenes through dynamic lighting and clever choice of cinematography. But not a few seconds later, right when my hope is peaked, we get the first piece of incredulity in this movie. The vessel in question comes across the wreckage of the Nostromo, as made clear by a large piece of floating debris that spells it out. I feel like this wasn't really necessary or makes any sense considering the nuclear explosion that occurred to create the wreckage in the first place. But aside from that, it's the fact that we then see what we can assume and are subsequently confirmed to see an alien floating around the remnants of the Nostromo, encased in what? Carbonite?
What is this? A crossover episode?
I mean, I don't see how. Is this some brand new piece of biological defense mechanism or something? Or did this happen over time? Is this something to do with the nuclear explosion? I mean, I understand that the idea of the xenomorph just floating around in space like a big gyrating bobblehead isn't exactly imposing, but this doesn't make any sense either. And the thing is, why is the alien floating near the Nostromo wreck? It wasn't ejected from the Nostromo. It was ejected from the Narcissus shuttle after the blast with Ripley. So wouldn't it be millions of miles away from the blast origin by now, and nowhere near the Nostromo? I mean, it's been 17 years since the incident. The alien would be fucking millions of light years away. But alright, let's suspend belief and just go with it. We are then introduced to Rain, and right off the bat I thought it was odd that Rain mentions that they owe 3 months of what I assume is rent. Why? This is a mining planet. Wouldn't Weyland-Yutani provide the workers with rooms and a place to live whilst they work the mines? Because who else would own property on this world? There's 2,500 people living there who I all assume work for Weyland-Yutani. So why would rent be something that's prevalent? Why would anybody actively choose to work for this company? This is a derivation of what we already know about Weyland-Yutani, and it's not a good one. It doesn't add anything really into the motivation of our characters apart from the fact that they're a big, ruthless company that doesn't want to pay its workers. But that has not been the case that has been established in every single other movie regarding Weyland-Yutani. I mean, they're a technological monopoly. They basically rule the known universe. They maintain the majority of control in almost every domain of human existence at this point. But in all the previous movies, they're never really made out to be utterly ruthless. Perhaps in the clandestine operations behind the scenes, and in their quest to sort of discover the xenomorphs or use them for military applications or whatever. But they don't actually treat their employees like slaves the way this movie suggests. So the people born on this colony might not have a choice. However, that's another inconsistency in itself. How long has this colony been there? Are we talking multi-generational life in this place? Because I don't think that's what they're trying to suggest. But if that is the case, why would Weyland-Yutani want anyone to live there that aren't miners? Don't they need people to not die and work? How would the colonists survive when the conditions are so poor physically and economically? I mean, I guess this movie is trying to make it out like this is the frontier and is the only place that you can get meaningful work, but again, that's just not what we see in every other aspect of this universe. Moving on, the shots depicting the world I thought looked really great. really grim and dark and convey the brutal nature of the work they're doing. It makes it feel like a lived-in world, but it does provoke questions about how there were so many prostitutes and old people milling about. Like again, wouldn't the population be only essential workers at 2,500? How could multi-generational life even be sustained if people keep dying of Lyme and lung disease? I mean, Rain's parents died of Lyme disease, but you see old people walking about. So is it only miners that get sick? Or does everyone else get exposed at a much lower level so it takes longer? But that doesn't seem to be the case because you can see old people in the background shots. Also, why would Weyland-Yutani want these conditions to be endured? I understand that they're not the most philanthropic company, but if your very small mining force on your space colony are dying due to diseases caused by the mining operations, you should probably address that, because I would imagine getting any human being out to that location is probably a fairly cost-intensive exercise. I also think they should have said the population was like 50,000 and made some mentions of some other companies that employed miners and workers, as the size of the colony in some of the shots looked like it would support a much larger population size. The fact that there's such a diversity of people is also questionable. I mean, this is in stark contrast from the colony on LV-426 on Aliens and Sevastopol in Isolation, where it's stated very explicitly that people take these jobs for economic reasons, as there is usually quite a decent payday at the end. Otherwise, why would anyone do this? But also, more to the point, that everyone has a specific function and there's an official record of what everyone's duties are. And that is clearly not the case in Romulus, with prostitutes and small children and what looks like drifters just floating about. It looks like a depressing homage to an 80s Rust Belt coal mining town, where the workforce is comprised of a bunch of unidentifiable drifters who work just enough to support their alcoholism, and not a well-planned and well-managed expedition out into the frontiers of space to establish new colonies for human beings to thrive and explore. Anyway, then we move on and we get the line about contracts and quotas whilst Rain is talking to the official Weyland-Yutani planet representative person. Now obviously this scene is the primary motivation for why Rain actually ends up going with the crew up to the Romulus station. So the doubling of her work quota gives her that extra push that she needs to leave. But again, why would Weyland-Yutani do this? This is the richest company in existence, but it needs a slave labor force to operate its mines? Also, I'd love to know what this Wei-Yu administrator gets out of this deal. I mean, she's stranded on this shithouse colony as well, so what's her benefit? And why don't people just rise up and revolt? There's 2,500 colonists, but you don't see a single Weyland-Yutani security or executive that is shown. Outside of the fat administrator who's obviously not going to be able to resist any type of provocation. So it is difficult to see where all the fear and control is being directed from. Rain also has an android that's stronger than every human being on that colony and does explicitly what she says. I mean, why not just use him to, I don't know, take over and get all the beans and square bread that you can eat? I mean, I do understand why they put this sort of political messaging in the movie regarding cost of living, because that has become a major issue that's prevalent in a lot of places globally at the moment, and the fairly amoral behavior of a lot of corporations and how they treat their employees like servants, Amazon, Walmart, etc. But this is the first time that Weyland-Yutani has really been portrayed as like a blatantly autocratic and controlling dynasty. Like again, the previous entries have established the position of this company as being the richest that's ever existed. But the employees and the people that exist in the world still seem to have rights, like space miners, colonists, and terraformers. This movie makes it out like they are literal feudal serfs, and I don't think it was needed. Right after this, we get a scene that shows Andy being attacked and harmed by some Asian kids. I mean, he gets dropped by these kids. So compared to Ash, Bishop, and Samuels, as well as the working Joes in Isolation, Andy is somehow weaker than a human being physically, yet still has the social sophistications of higher level Weyland-Yutani synthetics. Anyways, to wrap up my issues with the world building of the colony, I don't get why this couldn't just be similar to Isolation, or even all the colonies from Dark Descent. The writers have really made a departure in the way that Weyland-Yutani operates, and it's not at all how they've been portrayed historically, and it really doesn't add much. It is convenient for our characters, but it is world-breaking as far as the themes of the universe is concerned. I want to make a slight digression here and talk about some of the issues with the chronology of spaceflight tech in this universe. And it will sound like nitpicking, but this really is an issue that is prevailing throughout all these movies, and it undermines some of the credibility of the plot. So in the first movie Alien, once Mother has woken the crew up, Lambert says they are just short of Zeta 2 Reticuli, which is 39 light years from Earth, and it will take them 10 months to get back from their current position. This is right near LV-426 in the year 2122. In the events of Aliens, the year is 2179, 57 years after the incident with the Nostromo. When the Marine military ship the Sulaco gets ordered to go inspect the colony at LV-426, they were 40 light years away, and it only takes them a few weeks to get there due to the advances in faster-than-light travel. Aliens Romulus takes place in the year 2142, so it's been 20 years since the events of the first movie. The Jackson's mining colony is 65 light years from Earth, so by using the logic that was established in the first movie, the time it would take to get back to Earth at the most is like 15 months. However, it's been 20 years, so the technology would have improved, so it has to be faster than 15 months. But even if it hasn't, why wouldn't Rain and the others choose to go back to Earth? As that's the significantly closer planet that they know is populated with human beings that they could go to. Do people not care about slavery anymore? Didn't synthetics get built to do all the mundane bullshit tasks that people didn't want to do? I mean, that's what Sevastopol shows in isolation. Why would a mining facility employ workers to permanently live entire lifetimes on a planet that makes you die instead of rotating people in and out? I mean, the Nostromo was a towing ship, so its job was to take minerals and ore from these colonies back to Earth. So why wouldn't they do like a FIFO on a space scale? So despite being only 15 months from Earth, no one can ever actually leave this colony willingly. Couldn't they wait for a towing vessel like the Nostromo to come and collect the iron ore and minerals, and then through a hostile mutiny take over the vessel and then fly back to Earth? The faster than light issues also mean, why would the crew want to go to this Yzma system? That's 9 years travel time, not 9 light years, 9 years of travel. So that's around like 450 light years based on the way the Nostromo traveled in the first movie. So why the fuck would they want to go there? If the mining vessels have FTL ability, which they do based on the plot of this movie, wouldn't there be enough to get back to Earth? Is there literally no way for anyone other than towing freighters to get to this colony? I know Aliens changed the FTL rules a little bit, but it had been nearly 60 years. And the Sulaco was a military craft. And I think that is an important distinction. A sophisticated military craft is going to have the most up-to-date technology, whereas an industrial mining vehicle might be using technology that is multiple generations antiquated. Although these movies don't really explore how sophisticated this technology is this something that's prevalent across every single ship that operates throughout the universe? Or is the really quick FTL travel reserved for like the executive Prometheus level spacecrafts? Anyways, the introduction to the crew was done in a somewhat vain attempt to emulate the first crew of Aliens, which makes sense, but you're not exactly endeared to the new ones. You don't really invest in any of their motivations. They lack the gravitas of the crew of the Nostromo, which all had unique interests and personalities. In Romulus, I think it's the overt arrogance of a lot of the crew and the fact that they are so young, which makes it hard to connect. Space truckers are also not supposed to all look like they can moonlight as models. It's an issue with young adults that need to be commanding and have rapid growth on screen. Their youth can make their skills feel a bit unearned. What's interesting is Kaylee Spaney, who plays Rain, or New Ripley, was only 3 years younger than Sigourney Weaver when she first starred in Alien. Yet for some reason, Ripley has so much more kudos and authority to her performance. So the youth of the characters does to me feel a bit misplaced, at least for this plot. That's also not to say they didn't act well, they all did a good job. No one really gave a poor performance, it was really the writing that let them down. After we meet the crew, we get more plot devices that, while seem simple, were motivated by inconsistencies and confused ideas. The motivation to get off planet was fine, but the crew being aware of the Weyland-Yutani station orbiting above them that has this cryopod fuel that can all help them get to the sun planet was another incredulous moment. Wouldn't there be others on that planet who could detect this? Like the Wei-Yu company? Also, how can they detect this? Something called the hyperlink? Technology in these movies is kind of all over the place. Sometimes it's PDT, sometimes it's random signals, radio. Now what? Just picking up the vibes? I'll come to the tracking issue in just a moment, but a small digression is, I guess we're also supposed to assume that despite none of them ever having lived in the sun, apart from when they can go up and take space joyrides, that they are able to physically tolerate being exposed to it without an atmosphere to disperse a lot of the UV. I mean, depending on how long it's been since you haven't seen the sun, your level of sensitivity could be extreme. Rain has lived her entire life in perpetual darkness, has never actually seen the sun. That would make her eyesight unbelievably sensitive to bright sunlight. This could also be a convenient way to explain why people are dying so young. Vitamin D and sunlight are kind of critical aspects in the whole human longevity thing. So we then learn that the crew needs Andy to come along to the Romulus station because of Mutha, the AI language that interfaces with all Weyland-Yutani synthetics, and it's one of those plot points that is just so convenient. They just happen to know the one person on the entire colony that not only has a synth, but one that obeys her directly and not the Weyland-Yutani company. It's also a synth that can connect with highly controlled military machinery and tech, despite Andy being described as old Weyland-Yutani junk found in the trash, yet can somehow interface with what I assume to be the most sophisticated facility built by Weyland-Yutani to house classified data and specimens, probably in the entire universe. Why would engineers design a system like this? It's one thing for their hubris to preclude the notion that the synths can override their own programming, but if your synthetics can also take directives from a primary user, what's from stopping anyone from doing exactly what Andy is told to do? I mean, if we use Bishop in Aliens as an example, he did have a directive to preserve a sample and get one back to Weyland-Yutani, but that movie did show that there was an evolution in the synthetic heuristics and programming. The ones that would place a priority on human lives over the priority of the Weyland-Yutani agenda. Unlike what we saw with Ash, who was told directly by Weyland-Yutani that the specimen was the priority and all other priorities, including human life, had been rescinded. So I have no issues with the ideas that Andy can interface with Weyland-Yutani technology, but the fact that he gets all these privileges and access is what I find difficult to believe. It makes me think that Weyland-Yutani would make sure to decommission and destroy any synth, no matter how insignificant they are, if they can gain these levels of access that Andy is just given on a whim. Anyways, we then get Rain being convinced to take the mission, and while she is contemplating things outside, she happens to glance at a canary in a cage being carried by one of the miners, for just a subtle piece of symbolism. It's also interesting that a canary is even there. Like, for those who don't understand the expression, a canary in the coal mine harkens back to a time where miners used canaries to determine carbon monoxide levels. If the bird, who has a much lower tolerance to carbon monoxide, would die, the miners would know that they should get out. This practice was obviously replaced by electronic sensors in the 80s. So the bird was placed here for the sole purpose of contrasting Rain's metaphorical prison with that of the birds. I mean, there are so many other ways that you could have achieved this same sentiment, but apparently they want it to be about as obvious as dropping a toaster in your bathtub. Also, just one quick comment about the mining technology in this movie. It's not even remotely kept up with the faster than light travel, cloning, synthetics, terraforming, and general military technology of the times. Plus the whole Lyme disease angle. Now, I couldn't quite hear it in the movie, but I did have the captions on and it explicitly says Lyme disease. And if you don't know, that is a tick-borne disease. So somehow there are ticks on this colony. I guess we have to assume they're being brought in some way. And I'm not saying it's a fun disease, but I don't think you can actually die of Lyme disease unless you're seriously immunocompromised. So we then see the crew takes off in their mining craft, which I guess Weyland-Yutani is pretty lax about regarding the operation of these vessels. No flight logs or schedules, just take off and do whatever, I guess. The visuals of the takeoff are spectacular though. I did think it looked really great. The sharp red and yellow lights from the thrusters and then the super wide shot with the yellow lightning was such a great way to give some scale to what was happening. The shots of the planet engulfed in smoke and fire, as well as the giant planetary rings revolving around the colony. And these scenes did a really great job at demonstrating that you can use CG effectively. And being able to use a color palette that's warm and more stylized really works well and is a nice contrast and relief to the overused cool and sterile blues of modern sci-fi movies like Prometheus. I also thought the movie did a really good job with the sound design and especially the score. It incorporated some of those old romantic motifs from the original movie, especially as we watch the vessel head towards the station as the sun sweeps across the bow of the craft. This of course did remind me about how blinding that light would be to all of the crew, most of which have spent their entire lives living in perpetual darkness. That sun would be seriously bright. It's nearly 100 times brighter in space as there is no atmosphere to disperse the light. Also, I don't understand how Rain has never seen the sun before. Is Weyland-Yutani so strict that she's never actually gone on board one of these vessels with her ex-boyfriend before just to have a look? Maybe it's supposed to be implied that what they are doing is very much illegal and they are likely to be imprisoned when they return back to the colony. I mean, you don't get that impression, but perhaps that's why she's never been in space. As we move through the next series of shots getting them on board the station, we can see how Fade gets 10 out of 10 points for the production design of this movie. I mean, so many of the sets look like they could have been in the first two movies. Everything is raw and gritty and appropriate to the environments that the crew are in. Lots of really interesting lighting shots throughout this movie as well, often ones that you would see in the horror suspense genre, but it's nice to see some diversity in how the light is motivating each scene and acting as an emotional moderator. I also like how he matched the vents to the original one. It's a really nice homage, and it's a great way to continue the uniqueness of the world by incorporating the aspects that defined it and really separated it from all other sci-fi. So as the crew begins to move through the vents, we now get an idea of gravity purging on board the station. And as soon as I heard that, I thought, I wonder how this is going to be used as a piece of convenience for the crew later on that solves a problem that otherwise couldn't be solved. But we keep moving through and we get more fantastic scenes that are well lit and stylized, and overall the ones that you saw in the trailer that made it look so enticing. I enjoyed seeing the cryopods come out of the floor and watching the crew boot up the station using the old monitors and simplistic OS UI. But once they've checked the pods, we find out that there's not enough fuel to get to Yzma 3. However, they do have enough fuel to get back to Earth. This is not mentioned, but you can tell they have a couple of years, so they could go back to Earth and then find a new way from there. But they don't talk about it. Earth is no longer a possibility for anyone for some reason. Just this brand new planet that's 9 years away that's some kind of non-Weyland-Yutani utopia. The English lad then says Imhotep 3 is the nearest system, and if you saw earlier, the colony is only 65 light years from Earth. Ivana 2 is 9 years in cryosleep. So that's just wrong. That's about 400 more light years. So we have no idea what he's talking about. Also, I'm not really sure it makes things very intelligible when you have light years as a unit of measurement and then years of travel time as a separate unit. It's like saying I'm heading out to the shops, I'll be back in 300 seconds or 1/16,000th of a year. It's like, just pick one please, that's easy for the audience to understand. So then the crew has to go find more cryofuel which is on board the ship somewhere. And we learn that Mr. English lad hates the synths because one made a calculation to save 12 miners from a gas leak, condemning 3, one of whom was his mother. I mean, this isn't even something related to synthetics. Pretty much everyone would have made that decision. If the options are 12 saved and 3 dead versus 15 dead, I think the answer's pretty clear. So I'm not sure why they need to have this artificial anger and hostility towards Andy. It doesn't impact the plot in any way. I really think it's there just to mimic how Ripley felt towards synthetics after the first movie. Like to maintain this trope that people are skeptical of synthetics. Because Ash's behavior in the first Alien, I'm pretty sure, was an anomaly. We then learn that the random girl is Pregananant, so now we have our host for the new alien type, of course, because no matter what, every new Aliens movie, we have to have a new type of alien, even if the new one is dog shit. We then see the titular name of the movie explained and why they used the Romulus and Remus mythology from ancient Rome, which I guess means the next movie will logically be Aliens Maximus Decimus Meridius. And from this point on, the movie basically becomes a big list of spoilers, so if you don't want to know, then I guess just go watch some other shit. Most of the sequences up to the one with the facehugger scene were okay. I mean, there's a few plot holes and issues, but nothing so major that it breaks you out of disbelief completely. However, once we get to the first facehugger scene, it's basically open season on stupid writing choices. So they have to break the cryopods out of the walls, and when they do, the alarms start going off and the doors become sealed. That makes sense, all good. New Ripley and Bulletproof Monk then go into the control room to try and help. New Ripley says she can transfer the credentials from the old synth on the floor to give to Andy to gain him more clearance. Again, how is this a practice that Weyland-Yutani would implement? There are so many inherent security risks with being able to do that, this scenario being one of them. The synths are just tools to be used by people. I get that the science officer would want to have access to that room, but he's only answering to Weyland-Yutani, so why wouldn't his credentials be specific to him and his role? I mean, we already have permissions in apps like Instagram, so I don't feel like it's much of a stretch to assume that a multi-trillion-dollar company and the richest in the universe is able to implement some of these design decisions that would prevent levels of corporate espionage that I assume they want to avoid. However, that's not even the biggest problem in this scene. It's the fact that Weyland-Yutani is now engineering the facehuggers. This has a pretty big impact on the world and the timeline of all the events from Alien leading up to Romulus. This means prior to the events on LV-426, they already had not only the ability to manufacture facehuggers, but also to use them to create xenomorphs. This means that the final shred of mystery and uncertainty about this species has been diminished. They have gone from an unknown apex predator that can't be matched, unheard of and unseen in the universe, to being manufactured by Weyland-Yutani after being reverse engineered from a xeno that produces the same goo created by the Prometheus goo people. So that's it. No more questions or imagination to be used to wonder about all the possibilities of the origin story of the Xenos, just another weapon created by a different species in goo form that can now be cloned by human beings. I mean, goddamn, is Weyland-Yutani more sophisticated than the super race of white goo people that made us? I mean, they don't even need the goo, just a byproduct of the goo that they can then extract the sample from. The evolution of the Xeno lore and origin has reached levels of dissatisfaction only experienced by people who sat down with dinner and then ate it all before finding anything to watch. I mean, this is such a letdown of an explanation. I really think they're gonna have to change the name of this franchise. It shouldn't be called Alien, it should just be called Weyland-Yutani. Also, just a comment on the origin story of the Xenos. I've always thought and said this whenever I was talking about the Aliens franchise. They should have just had the alien species biologically operate the same way that the arachnids did in Starship Troopers. Have them maintain those exact same characteristics that insect colonies have. Have the aliens still operate based on a centralized hive that's controlled by a matriarch, and have the interactions be eusocial between all the other drones and members and constituents of that colony. And have the primary motivation essentially be just a complete assimilation of all other biological species that exist within the universe. I know that might seem quite simple and not that interesting as a fundamental premise, but at least those characteristics don't utterly dilute the entire nature of the species. It also preserves some of the implicit mystery about how the species came to be from a biological perspective. Was it an evolution from bacteria? Was it the outcome of other species that had bred together? Or just another kind of inexplicable physical anomaly? I mean, half the fun is discussing what the potential origin story could be. I mean, we don't know exactly what the events were that led to the Big Bang, and look how many people endlessly debate that shit. That Genesis story does not violate any of the events that have occurred across the franchise. The eggs on the derelict could have just been salvaged from a meteor that had crashed down on LV-426 and placed into the ship's storage, or just salvaged elsewhere, and then one of the facehuggers breaks free as it's just following its biological impetus, attaches itself onto the navigator, causing the ship to crash. So then we come to the facehugger scene, or at least the first one, which I thought was visually engrossing, but overall disappointing to see the facehuggers altered in their behaviour. Before, they stayed hidden and carefully and often silently moved around stalking their prey, concealed in their eggs, ready to burst forth upon disturbance to catch a victim unaware. Now they are just highly visible, running about in the open, and again, mystery is what preserves a lot of the fear. We then of course get the foreshadowed Lex Luthor girl with the X-ray one, so we know she's gonna die. We then get the scene showing Andy getting upgraded using Ash's synth chip, and I mean, this is some serious engineering foresight to quality control and commit to a shared hardware ecosystem that is cross-model compatible across hundreds of years of manufacturing. Even to the point where the firmware is physically increasing your strength. This is the one and only time we see this type of manufacturing and technological behavior in the entire franchise, so it's safe to assume that in-universe they gave up on this idea. Moving on, the facehuggers then failed to take down the English lad in the cryo room, despite there being 30 of them, at least that's what the computer monitor says. I mean, how that happens I have absolutely no idea. It took 3 fully grown Marines to save Ripley from 1 in Aliens, but these guys have the hypervigilance of your local paranoid conspiracy theorist. One of the facehuggers then jumps onto Bjorn's face and knocks him down, but despite the fact that it looks like it gets a pretty good grasp on his head, it doesn't actually manage to impregnate him. I mean, again, Ripley, 3 Marines, maybe the rationale is because they're engineered they're not as strong as the original ones. I mean, that could be an explanation. I mean, it's a shit one, but it still works. I really don't know why they had to have the scene like this. If you go back to Aliens and you look at that scene with the facehuggers with Ripley and Newt, there were only 2 facehuggers present, and the suspense and fear in that room was palpable. This scene just needed to have 1 or 2 facehuggers be in there and build the suspense just like in Aliens. But no, we get this pseudo version of the facehuggers that are nowhere near as strong or as foreboding as the original, because apparently they're strong enough to rupture open a door that Andy couldn't move before, but at the same time are not strong enough to facehug Bjorn. Okay. So of course, as they're all escaping, Bald Monk Girl gets pregnanted, and we knew that because we watched the trailer, and because she touched the wand, and thems be the rules of the world. Then we get to the reintroduction of Ash, or Rook in this movie. And for the life of me, I don't know why they used Ian Holmes' likeness for this. The CGI has that uncanny valley look, and really doesn't add much apart from the fact that they now have a tangible link back to Alien. Rook then explains what's happening to the crew, and we begin the expositional decline into the Valley of Incomprehension. for it's made unclear just how much Weyland-Yutani and the station know about the Xenos already. What we do know is that they were aware of the Nostromo coming into contact with the Xeno and it getting blown out of the airlock. Now, how is it that they know this? It's not mentioned at all, but I guess we just have to assume it's through a flight recorder of some sort, either one on the Nostromo or on the Narcissus. So the one on the Nostromo was destroyed, and the one on the Narcissus shuttle doesn't have anything useful on it. As we learned this in Aliens 2, when Ripley is in the debrief scene with Weyland-Yutani, they say it only corroborates part of her story and nothing to do with the actual Xeno itself. This is when I think the movie should have acknowledged the events in Alien Isolation. Because in that game, the Nostromo's flight recorder was picked up by the Anesidora due to its homing beacon, and then it was eventually brought back to Sevastopol after the ship had returned to LV-426. Weyland-Yutani was then subsequently alerted to the fact that the beacon had been found, and then the events of Isolation transpire. And in-game, this is where you find out that the data on the flight recorder had either been corrupted due to the extraction process, or a member from Weyland-Yutani had deliberately erased it. But that being said, trying to understand the timeline of all these movies and how technology spans across each different installation is a bit like trying to drink a glass of water on a trampoline. This is due to a clear lack of understanding between methods of communication between planets and ships and Mutha and the in-universe technological advances. Like, what exactly is the rule here? Because it's changing all the time. How long does it take to send a basic message? How quickly does Mutha relay data back to Weyland-Yutani headquarters, which I assume is back on Earth or on a station in orbit somewhere? I mean, so many of these problems could be resolved with like 2 lines of dialogue. But no, we better not establish any rules in the universe that can't be violated, because then we wouldn't be able to undo our bad plot. So Rook says it takes around 6 months to send a message from the Renaissance station back to Earth. That's 65 light years from the station. So if we use the travel times from the first Alien movie, which took the Nostromo 10 months to get back to Earth from when they received the signal right near LV-426, applying that formula to Romulus means 65 light years would take around 15 months. So using some big math skills, it seems like you can communicate in a bit less than half the light years worth of travel time. So 15-month travel time, around 5-6 months for communications to get through. Just like it was in the first Alien movie. So here's where things start to not make sense. In Alien Isolation, Amanda is informed by Samuels that the flight recorder from the Nostromo has been found and she can go to Sevastopol to get closure. The Anesidora finds the flight box and goes to LV-426, then to Sevastopol. Once they've arrived back at the station, Foster, one of the Anesidora's crew members that had been impregnated by a facehugger and had been subsequently put into cryosleep, is woken up, and within 24 hours, the chestburster comes forth. 4 days after the chestburster has been born and has escaped into the station, Samuels and Amanda depart an unknown location on board the Torrens to head towards Sevastopol. Weyland-Yutani is made aware of the alien and tells its representatives on the station to do as much research on the Xeno as possible. 2 days after this, Weyland-Yutani buys the Seegson station and gives Apollo the new directive to prioritize the Xeno's safety. 24 days after the departure of the Torrens from an unknown location, it arrives at the station, and then the events of Alien Isolation unfold. So all this has occurred within the time frame of around 2 months. So Weyland-Yutani within the Romulus setting must be aware of what's happened in Alien and Isolation. Even though in Isolation we learn that the flight recorder gets wiped, they must have already been made aware, because otherwise why else would they have bought the station? So there is a critical amount of importance being placed on the legitimacy of the flight recorders. Not only throughout the movies, but also the games, as it is how a lot of the plot lines are being connected and some of these timelines drawn. But it also seems like it's a really easy way to just justify the very large continuity holes that are being created. The events in Alien Isolation demonstrate a rapidly improved ability to communicate, compared to 15 years earlier in Alien on board the Nostromo, where it would have taken several months to send a message back to Earth. In Isolation, it took less than a week for the report to be made and for Amanda to depart for Sevastopol. So it's much harder now to use the delay of communications as a rationale to why people aren't aware that certain events have occurred, like the one occurring in Romulus. Also, if ships have recorders, a station like Sevastopol surely would have to have some type of redundancy backup recorder. Probably several, but even if they didn't, wouldn't the Torrens and the Anesidora also have flight recorders? Now this is important because while Sevastopol was bought by Weyland-Yutani, it was originally a Seegson-owned station, so not under the umbrella of Weyland-Yutani. How would people not be aware of like $1 trillion station going down with like 500 plus deaths and multiple ships? all able to send communications back to Earth within a week. I mean, when the Deepwater Horizon oil rig went down, that was like an international incident, so I'm fairly certain that a station with a monetary value that's worth probably more than most countries would be a significant red flag to many of the people that were involved. The reason I bring this up is because I've seen quite a lot of defense of this plot line in Romulus that uses the communication delays as a rationale to justify why nobody is aware that the station has been abandoned for 6+ months. But these are important things to determine because how else does Rook know all of the events that have occurred on the Nostromo? I've even seen the excuse that the Easter egg of Ripley's shuttle on board the station as an explanation. Fade says that it is Ripley's Narcissus shuttle in the background of one of the shots. However, this is on the condition that it doesn't fuck up any stories in the future. If it does, they can just pretend it's like a standard issue escape vehicle. So you can really see how well thought out that idea was. I mean, come on, the reason so many people are trying to defend this is because it's so obvious as a plot hole. They can ignore all the events of Isolation if they want, but it helps their story more than it harms it. So if you say that Isolation isn't canon, then Rook can only know these things from the flight recorder on board the Nostromo, which was destroyed in Alien. The game provides the explanation that it was ejected and then picked up by the Anesidora. But even so, if Romulus wants to go that route, it still fucks up their story anyway, because that would mean they would already have the coordinates to LV-426 and could just go back to the derelict instead of searching for 20 years for Big Chap floating about in space. If the explanation is they got Ripley's shuttle and then it's her flight recorder, it doesn't detail any of the events of what occurred on board the Nostromo, so how would they know anything about the xenomorph? It's also made very clear in that debrief scene with Weyland-Yutani and aliens that the flight recorder on board the Narcissus does not outline any of the events that occurred on the Nostromo. So the next excuse I always see regarding Weyland-Yutani's behavior in these movies is it's all just their attempt to cover their tracks. And any time an event that occurs that may reflect badly on the company or implicate them in some type of criminal proceedings, they mitigate it by just distancing themselves from that issue and denying. Whilst I do understand that this is a reasonable explanation for their conduct, it still doesn't explain how woefully unprepared they always seem to be whenever they have an engagement with the Xenos. Because in the events of Alien and Aliens, Weyland-Yutani, if they are deliberately covering up the events that have occurred, that means they feel like they have to be accountable to someone. I mean, there has to be a threat coming to them from somewhere, either a government or an independent body or maybe even another competing company. Otherwise, why would they make any attempts to conceal their behavior? Wouldn't they just have an overt declaration that they are on a quest for the Xenos and will stop at absolutely nothing and spare no expense and sacrifice whoever they want so long as they pursue their goal? But that's not how they operate, which means they do have a fear of reproach and it's coming from somewhere. It can't be Ripley. She wasn't woken up for another 37 years after Romulus. But let's be real, if Weyland-Yutani had come into contact with the Narcissus shuttle, they would have killed Ripley the second they figured out who she was. And if Weyland-Yutani is this completely autocratic, amoral rogue that everyone makes them out to be, then they would kill Ripley the second she posed a threat to their narrative. So I don't think Fade thought about this long enough because it doesn't make any sense that the Romulus would pick her up. So Weyland-Yutani's awareness of the events of Alien is still not really explained. How did Rook and the station know to look for the alien? Big Chap was blown out of the shuttle and not the Nostromo. I mean, even if you ignore that for a second and go back to the game, the Torrens also blew a Xeno out of the airlock. But Rook says they spent nearly 20 years trying to find the Big Chap from the Nostromo. But why would they be searching for that one when they know of one already that was ejected from the Torrens like 5 years ago as opposed to 20? So even if they use the game, it still fucks with their story. However, if they're following the timelines of the game, then how do they not know where the beacon is? They can just go back to LV-426 themselves. The communication inconsistencies are now really obvious. In Aliens, they can get from Earth to LV-426 in a matter of weeks. So communication should be within a day. So what's going on in Romulus? How does it take 6 months at that point to send a communication? I mean, again, this is actually a good reason for the movie to ignore Isolation from the communication premise, but completely fucks it up as far as their awareness of the Xeno is concerned. Because in Isolation, the ability for people to communicate is about on par as what they can do in Aliens. And Romulus is 5 years after Isolation, so the communication should actually be slightly better and not significantly worse. So at the end of all this, what's the answer? I mean, there really isn't one. This is just a plot hole. They wanted to have a scene where they could include events from Alien, and they did, just really poorly. They also had to use Ash, which didn't work, and it fucks with a lot of the events and plots post-Romulus now as well. Which is why I feel like if you are adding to a cinematic universe, you either go way before or way after. It's so much easier to write and update the rules as opposed to sliding them in the middle of other events with a bunch of half-baked new ideas that violate and retcon the old. But no, let's run with what they've got. They used the flight recorder to make a determination of where they thought the xenomorph would be in space. I mean, I'm not exactly sure how they even picked this up in the first place. I mean, they can barely find the xenomorphs when they're in good conditions, let alone floating around in space. Wouldn't it make more sense for them to be searching for Ripley? I mean, again, if you believe that they know every single event that occurred on the Nostromo, I guess this is a moot point, but why wouldn't they be looking for Ripley? How do they know that she's not impregnated with a xeno? Or another thing, why don't they go back to LV-426 and search for the derelict? I mean, they are the ones that sent the Nostromo to those coordinates in the first place. Why wouldn't they just go back there? I mean, an interview with James Cameron about this exact concern says that the derelict gets damaged by volcanic activity on planet, and that's why the beacon is no longer active for the events of Aliens, and it's only through Ripley and the debrief scene that Burke gets the manual coordinates and then tells a colonial family to go investigate. Which explains why the colonizers don't pick up the beacon, but it doesn't explain at all how the Romulus station knows about everything that happened in Alien. But somehow Weyland-Yutani knows nothing come Aliens time. And I know that people say the debrief scene is a bunch of insurance suits and misdirection and they don't know anything and it's all part of a much bigger cover-up operation and compartmentalized elements within the company, internal political ambitions from Weyland-Yutani rogues that all have the ability to control these events, blah blah blah. Which is of course why the cover-up explanation is the most convenient. But if Weyland-Yutani is already aware of the xenomorphs before Romulus, I don't understand why they wouldn't have taken more precautions regarding the security of the station. I mean, every time there's an interaction with the Xeno, everyone involved dies, vehicles and infrastructure and buildings are usually destroyed, and there's usually a significant nuclear component. But if they already know about the Xenos, then they know where they got them from, and that was on LV-426. Are we supposed to believe that there's more of a chance of finding one tiny xenomorph floating around the vast expanse of space than it is to return to a planet that you already know exists, that you had the coordinates for, to search for a ship that you know contains specimens that you want? Do you want to know how you avoid these problems? 1. Don't have Rook say anything about communication time. Just say the station jammed all communications when it went dark. 2. Completely abandon any notion that they're aware of events that occurred in Alien or on the Nostromo. And 3, use the game Alien Isolation as the foundation for your story arc. Say that they are searching for the xenomorph that was blown out of the airlock of the Torrens. This does not violate any of the timelines that already exist or events pre and after Romulus. Anyways, that's a long digression, but moving on to the next universe-betraying scene is the chestburster coming out of Goldilocks and the two idiots who board the mining craft. So we get the scene of her shining the X-ray at her chest to see the alien eating its way out, and it was a really cool effect, but why the fuck would she have carried the wand from the station? She's literally fleeing in panic, but thinks, I better keep the wand just in case. I mean, she doesn't know what's happening, so she's taking that thing on a whim. That's not even the real issue though. We have now escalated the gestation time of a facehugger from days into minutes, and that's really shit as a practice to implement. I get that people don't want physics lessons, but it makes sci-fi more enjoyable when there's at least some plausibility behind the biology and physicality of the universe. Otherwise, fuck it, just be Star Wars and have people flying about like Mary Poppins. Because in Romulus, the gestation period is about 4 minutes because otherwise the plot doesn't work. So we have to have an organism that in reality would consume so much energy and mass to grow that the host would disintegrate, but also remove any actual reason for a host in the first place. Also, having the X-ray wand, whilst a cool visual spectacle, is such a nonsense addition to the world. Why would that be a thing? So if they know the life cycles of the Xeno due to the flight recorder, then what use is seeing it in an X-ray? It's going to be pretty damn obvious if one's laid an egg on you due to the whole face-hugging element, but also, when would this even be used? On someone that they are aware has a xenomorph implanted in them, or someone that they just suspect might have had a facehugger on them? Because on this space research facility, there's really only one option that's going to ever occur. And if it does occur, like it does, then you're not going to have enough time to ever need a wand or be aware that a wand would be useful. Also, engineering facehuggers, I mean, I could spend about 2 hours on that alone, but we really have lost all mystery and menace to this species now. They can be cloned and altered, David can manufacture them from goo in a makeshift lab, but they may as well sell these things like sea monkeys in a packet. I mean, the notion of having an alien queen has just been obliterated. I mean, we can thank Ridley for that because he initiated all these changes and allowed people to just bend the biology however they see fit. Anyway, so the chestburster breaks free, killing the bald girl, obviously, and then the vessel crashes into an open hangar bay, but also compromises the station just enough that it tilts it off axis, giving us a countdown timer for the rest of the movie. Which is really lucky because the movie would have been over in about 2 minutes if a million other things occurred in that exact moment. I mean, the scene still looks great, but that's another piece of 1 in a billion convenience for this crew. So it slides right into a hangar that's already open? I mean, that's odd. Also, I guess explosions in space in this universe are just not as significant anymore, because they used to kind of go complete vacuum and then everything would be sucked out. But now apparently giant fireballs just cause artificial motivators for all our crew as opposed to complete station-wide destruction at the end of the movie. But I get it, we need to have the same pressure that we had in Aliens. So right after this scene, we see the dumb and unlikable English lad kill himself by shocking the Xeno, which has now gone from facehugger to proto-Xeno to fully grown in 7 minutes. This was dumb. All of this is only happening because of the countdown due to the station drifting, because prior, they had up to 36 hours to grow to full size, but they have to artificially reduce the gestation period down so it could fit into this stupid 45-minute window that they created. Can I just say that they took that concept of having a time pressure window from Aliens because it added the extra tension, but in Aliens it actually made sense. The dropship crash and the Marines shooting the guns off within the reactor is what caused the initial emergency countdown to begin in the Aliens movie. So now it takes a Xenomorph about 2 minutes to get to full size. I mean, people really like to have a revisionist attitude to the biological aspects of the alien species, which has been made clear in every single piece of media except Isolation. They think because it's an alien that any bullshit idea can work regarding the metaphysics of its biology, but they seldom work. All it does is usually retcon previous actions and rules that now have to convolute the progression of events. Also, what was the alien gestating in? Like, I know we've never seen them create the hives that they live in, but one assumes it takes some hours at least, but this thing is in like a protective... What exactly is the point of a host at this stage? Why not just have facehuggers that give birth asexually and then have the aliens pull energy out of the matter in the air? So the stupid lad then dies, but his death scene is something that was quite bizarre. I mean, normally when people get hit in the chest and face and fingers with acid, it's pretty clear that it's the single most excruciatingly painful thing that you can experience, which is usually why everyone screams emphatically and writhes horrifically in pain. This lad sounds like he's stubbed his toe and he's trying to be quiet because he doesn't want to wake his parents up. I mean, what is he doing? Also, speaking of acid, the alien is dripping acid blood down into the mining vessel. I thought this was game over and would just drip through the hole. I mean, isn't this the entire reason for the swan song floating acid scene later on? Anyway, we then find out that facehugger's tracked by sound and heat signature, and what's odd is how this applies to the sneaking scene. Like, why is Andy sneaking? The facehuggers know that he's not a potential host. So we see during the chase, New Hicks throws a flare and a bunch of the facehuggers run to it. So why didn't Andy just run with the flare to distract them all in the other direction? Like, they had the flares prior to this chase. I watched this over again, he has the flares on him. I mean, why wouldn't you at least try get Andy to just lure them away? So we then cut to the scene where the Pregananant girl is trying to get out of the mining vessel but can't find the key. The alien takes quite a long while to actually give birth to itself. I mean, at least by the rules of this movie, the alien should be geriatric by now. But it takes such a long time to actually start motivating its way over towards the girl. Like, I don't know what it's doing, it's just looking at her menacingly, but not doing anything. We then move on to the scene with the girl getting captured with all the rainwater, and I think Faye did a really good job of building that fearful tension by utilizing the super close-up shots that restrict your field of vision, as it allows for the alien to potentially be introduced into frame at any point. I mean, across the first two movies, you never really see the aliens fully aside from the ceiling scene and the boss battle with the Queen. And the shots of where they were all out in the open were really dark. So Perugant then tries to escape, but Andy doesn't open the door, so she gets got and carried away. Andy states that we would all be dead, and I wondered if the Xenos actually give a shit about synths. I know in isolation they don't, but the Queen does try and kill Bishop in Aliens, so it's hard to tell if they see the synths as a threat or if they're just more of a nuisance. And they are attracted to heat, and I don't think the synthetics produce that much heat. So I assume the xenomorphs don't think they're human. And speaking of human, Rain then questions Andy like he was one, which I thought was odd. Why is she surprised? He's a machine following a series of instructions. There is obviously some nuance in their behavior, but they don't feel guilt or remorse, so it's not like he would give a shit about what they think or how she feels about him in that moment. Anyway, once New Ripley and New Hicks and the android get down into the lab, we get another disappointing piece of world-dismantling exposition from Romulus Rook, who says due to human beings' susceptibility to terraforming diseases and the general limitations physically, Weyland-Yutani wants to synthesize a biologic that can enhance and rapidly evolve human beings, like the Xenos, to produce a more perfect stage of organic being. We then see the goo vestibules in 3D visualized form from Prometheus and Covenant, just so we can have a reminder of that terrible idea that just keeps on giving. Rook Ash says the goo on its own is a destructive pathogen like we've seen before, but if acetylated and synthesized, it can be transformed to some miracle superhuman immortality drug. First of all, why is Rook Ash telling them this? He won't let them escape unless they have the cure, but he's got Andy now, so why wouldn't Andy just use Rain and Hicks as bait and then escape using the mining craft? Again, I think this calls into question how interested in synths the Xenos are. Like, if Rook wasn't somewhat disintegrated due to the acid blood in that previous control scene, would this movie just not have happened? Could he have just walked around completely unnoticed and unbothered by the Xenos doing whatever he wanted? Because the events of this movie and the way the aliens interact with Andy kind of suggest that that's what would have happened. This scene also brings up some of the communication issues again. Because was there no time at all for any type of communication to be sent by a single person on board? Because how was the facility overrun so quickly by just one xenomorph at the start, that no one could escape, eject any of the miracle drug, or even send Weyland-Yutani an email saying, hey, just want to let you know we cracked the goo code, now it's good night for all our terraforming problems. Also, one of the xenomorphs got loose and is systematically killing us all, can you please send some help? How was there no time for this? Rook made it seem like there was some type of last stand in some of those previous scenes regarding the Xenos and the security force, so how quickly was this takeover? Because remember, in the events of Alien Isolation, it starts off with one Xenomorph, but it takes like an entire month for the whole facility to get taken down. Why has no one from Weyland-Yutani been to this facility? Does everyone in this universe operate in a vacuum, or just everything regarding Weyland-Yutani? But the biggest problem with this motivation is, Weyland-Yutani already makes a perfect organism that never dies, feels pain, gets sick, needs sleep, and they've had them for hundreds of years. It's the synthetics. So on the one hand, apparently they can't manufacture an android army to do all these bullshit tasks, even though they seem to be aboard every commercial ship in the universe. They're also simultaneously so expendable that a lowly terraforming colonial has one as a pet. So which is it? Are they hard to make or not? I mean, I understand if they wanted the immortality drug outside of this and it was just the posthumous wishes of a now dead Weyland and his crusade for immortality, but it really seems that they just could have used the synthetics for terraforming as opposed to needing to turn every single human being into a Prometheus bald guy. Rook Ash says we cannot wait for human evolution anymore, and I guess I'm curious as to what the reasoning is behind that. Are humans dying off outside of terraformed planets? How many planets have been successfully terraformed? What's going on Earth? We do find out a bit later that the cure actually doesn't work because of course it doesn't, that would mean the whole universe and the threat of aliens would be over forever. I mean, how pressing is this as a threat that Weyland-Yutani feels like they need to invest a disproportionate amount of effort and resources into coming up with some type of immortality cure? But I guess they gave up on this shitty thinking because as we learn in Aliens, Weyland-Yutani just drops down those gigantic terraforming reactors that operate by themselves in isolation for decades. Once the atmosphere becomes breathable enough, that's when they send the colonists in. They call it shake and bake colonies in Aliens. So I guess this movie does actually support the premise that Weyland-Yutani stops using people to terraform planets and just uses machinery to automate it. Seriously, Ridley, you have no idea how much you've sabotaged this franchise. I'm honestly hoping one day someone comes along and just says Prometheus and Covenant were like a fucking dream or a simulation for exploration practice, because everything that he's done makes all this so much harder to explain. So now that we've endured the expo scene, they grab the goo and prepare to escape. So Andy then grabs a pulse rifle and hands it to New Hicks and says, "Do you know how to handle this?" And he says, yes I fucking can. And we get a scene that's obviously copying the Hicks and Ripley gun training scene from Aliens. So New Hicks says he knows what the Colonial Marines use because of games and magazines, but how exactly does that translate into actually knowing how to operate this gun? I mean, it's not like you'd go to a shooting range and when someone asks you, do you have any experience with firearms, you put your hand up and say, yeah, I played a lot of games. That's laughable. Also, why did they add this automatic aim feature? This is prior to the events of Aliens, so why wouldn't the Colonial Marines have this automatic aim assist function? This is another moment where the advent of some new technology doesn't do anything to enhance the story, but actively fucks up parts of previous ones. Why would Weyland-Yutani have automatic aim pulse rifles and not the Colonial Marines in 40 plus more years? Also, they put this in to make it more credible that Rain can use the gun, but not New Hicks, even though Hicks is a minor as well. So we then move along to the scene with the Progananant girl getting removed from the Xenohive, and they deliberate on whether or not to give her the miracle goo cure or not as she's dying. Because as of this moment, the girl looks like she is minutes away from death, so this decision is vital. However, we see 3 minutes later that she's talking very clearly and tells Rain that she can walk back to the ship on her own.
Right.
So right before they get in the elevator, New Hicks gets stabbed by a Xeno that's actually going for Rain. Don't know why he doesn't yell out, "Look out," or anything like that. We then see him get dragged up into the Xenohive in quite a cool scene that was utterly ruined by how fucking nonchalant New Hicks seems to be about his impending death. I mean, this isn't some hardened veteran Marine, this is a young 20s arrogant boy who I assume isn't so old and traumatized from life that he wishes for death just yet. He's dying and he's yelling, "Is that all you've got?" As the aliens run up and I assume dismember and kill him. I mean, what the fuck is going on with that? Why does it sound like he's playing Call of Duty or lingering outside the chip shop?
Oh, you want some? Huh? You want some?
Not being completely dismembered by the biological personification of evil. We then see Andy having a horizontal disco party with an alien chaperone. So this then answers the question about if the Xenos actually care about synthetics. And that is, no, they really don't. And all the facehuggers and Xenos just totally move past him. I mean, this is a bit of an issue as it really makes you wonder how many problems could have been solved with just Andy doing everything on his own. Or what would have happened if Rook didn't get dismembered by the acid. Like, in Aliens, Bishop crawls through the pipe to remote pilot the dropship back down to LV-426, but at that point he looks terrified, so I guess they don't know how the Xenos will interact with the synthetics as there's never really been a chance to observe it. However, if you take isolation as canon, which I certainly do, the Weyland-Yutani company would know via Sevastopol and Samuels that Xenos don't give a shit about the synthetics. So New Ripley abandons Andy to then change her mind not 5 seconds later and then tell the once mortally wounded Progananant girl that she can make it back to a cryopod on her own. And she's like, yeah, all good, I'm only bleeding to death. I mean, she was dying 1 minute ago, but now well enough to make it back to the ship on her own. Okay, Progananant decides to use the black goo to heal herself. I mean, she has no context whatsoever about what the goo is and what it would do to her, and a second prior she was in the middle of her death throes, so I'm not sure how she was so vigilant and cognitively aware enough to hear the one brief, out of context comment about not trusting Weyland-Yutani and the goo. This is a big stretch. But Progananant wants to go big alien mode, so the goo it is. Also, I couldn't really tell if this was all a ploy by Andy to get her back into the cryopod for stasis now that Andy is a cross between like Burke and Ash, or if the close-up shots of Prego's stomach were just supposed to indicate the fact that she doesn't want to die to save her baby, as opposed to being aware that she has a Xeno inside. If it is the latter, she has about 2 minutes to make that decision considering how quickly Baldy died and how fast the Xenos grow in this movie. I mean, this does fit the consistency that's been displayed throughout this movie so far. Maybe she had a facehugger runner not 2 seconds ago. Ripley then makes it back to Disco Andy, all with complimentary blue floor lasers. We then see a scene where Andy voluntarily removes his brain, which was another piece of massive plot contrivance. Andy follows whatever primary directive he has. It would make absolutely zero difference if he was dying or not how he feels about Rain personally. I mean, he can't feel anything for Rain personally. He's a machine who can't feel emotions or be manipulated in that way. But the movie wants her to have her friend back, so he relents for no reason, violating all the rules that we've established about the androids. I mean, I'm really not sure what the purpose of this scene is. She already had Andy's old chip in her pocket. Couldn't she have just uploaded him into a new synthetic body, as it's all just data, but she wants that specific body? I mean, Andy looks like he's about to cry in this scene, and that also doesn't make any sense. I feel like the writers have just forgotten that they're machines, because for all intents and purposes, they look just like real people. So we get the convenience of their utilities, but we also want them to be emotionally intelligent, because that's better for the drama. Ugh. So we then get to the swan song, where we get Rook saying he won't risk the compound, so he's gonna let them die. And by them, he means Rain, because the Xenos don't give a shit about Andy. But why does Rook want this? Because somehow he knows Progananant took the sample? Otherwise, I'm not sure what's changed from the 10 minutes prior when Rook wanted them all to escape and was giving them the compound and was telling them absolutely everything that they could possibly want to know about the station. So Rook wants to save Progananant knowing that she would give birth to an alien baby somehow? I mean, has he even seen her? Not sure what he hopes would happen there exactly. That Progananant would give birth and then he can remote part the ship back to the Weyland-Yutani facility. I mean, that's assuming the baby alien doesn't fuck up something in the ship, but okay. I mean, that's all kind of irrelevant considering that the station is going to be imploding, so how would he remote part the ship back anyway? I mean, none of them have suggested that they would dispose of the goo, so I guess Rook, being like all Weyland-Yutani representatives, has universal access to all information all the time, except at certain times when the plot needs people to be ignorant. Rook Ash then repeats that old line that Ash says in Aliens about sympathy, and it really doesn't feel good. It's kind of like the feeling you get 3 hours after eating asbestos. So now we get to the gravity battle, which we all knew was coming because of the scene where they were talking about the gravity purge. Apparently, you can just turn the gravity on and off from anywhere at the station at a whim. I mean, they have the power to turn off the gravity in the entire station, and the controls are right next to them. God, that is lucky. Also a massive OH&S safety risk that anyone can turn off the gravity at will. Again, why would that be something that would ever be needed? I mean, the whole gravity purge thing was such horseshit anyways, but this really is just the chronicles of ridiculous at this point. The aliens don't attack them because apparently they know they have the pulse rifle and their blood would leak down and expose the station. Not sure why this matters, as they can all survive in space. Also, they've seen this before. One of their alien compadres was dispatched in the control room. Which means, I guess when they killed New Hicks, they were really hoping to kill him before he fires any bullets. I mean, that's a big gamble, but there certainly is a lot of luck floating around in this movie. However, they don't care in the end, and we then get a scene that's not too reminiscent of the one that we saw in Aliens, where Ripley is going ham and eggs in the egg field shooting at the Queen. So we get to see the aliens getting completely blasted, and this scene does make you wonder again why automatic assist would be needed, but okay. So just like in the sentry scene in Aliens, right before Rain runs out of ammo, the aliens stop attacking. But just for a piece of context, in Aliens, there were 4 sentries that each had 500 rounds each. So when the aliens were strategically testing the perimeter, this actually felt realistic, as they're not going to just endlessly die. But Rain has the one pulse rifle, which apparently has a very big extended magazine that we can't see. Anyway, the acid blood is now suspended in the air because of the lack of gravity, but it's not just suspended, it's in a controlled vortex in the middle of the room. I mean, that's not really how gravity works. The blood would just go in whatever direction the initial momentum propelled it towards. But don't overthink it. So they begin to move through the acid field, and then we see there's no alien bodies, so I guess she didn't kill any. I mean, I thought she very clearly did, but okay, they're all gone. Not a single piece of dismembered alien appendage floating around, just blood. Okay, so they make it to the elevator, which doesn't work because the gravity is off and it uses a mechanical wheel and steel rope pulley system. I mean, are you serious? Not electrical elevators, but ones with actual wheels. Like literally near every single scene, there is some decision that is made that just obliterates your suspension of disbelief. Anyway, they begin to fly up the shaft, but of course Rain doesn't make it as the gravity comes back on in sections for some reason. So she begins to fall all the way back down and gets caught by a Xeno. But not just caught, like the Xeno gently absorbs all the momentum with its tail so Rain doesn't just snap her spinal column in half as she comes to a hard stop. Why does it do this? No idea. No precedent for it, we just can't have Rain die here. So because the gravity has come back on, the acid is now melting through the hull, and the Xeno just holds on to Rain for a really long time before the elevator comes flying back down to save the day, as well as blocking the rupture breaching the hull below. The Xeno then takes a significant amount of time trying to kill Rain, as the plot needs a facehugger to do the honors. I mean, I'm not sure why it would be doing that there, as the Xenos never do that, but okay. Rain eventually gets saved by Andy, who's coming flying down the elevator shaft at a rate that is not consistent with gravity. He then shoots the facehugger and the alien, and then we get the famous line from Ripley said by Andy, and I laughed right into my scorn.
Get away from her. You bitch.
If Amanda Ripley or Ellen says that line, then it's fine, but having a synthetic act like he's emotional when he's not is ridiculous. He also doesn't know if this alien is male or female, unlike in Aliens where Ripley is fighting the Queen. So that line is desperately tragic in so many different ways and is fan service in the absolute worst way. He then expends about 50 rounds into the alien to kill it, so I guess our concerns with the acid blood have just been completely removed for this scene. So the station is about to go boom boom, and Rook has now had a change of mind again as he waits for Andy and Ripley to get on board before he remote pilots the ship out of the exploding station for, I don't know, reasons that we just don't know about, I guess. The CGI of the station, however, was glorious. I mean, the sound effects and particle effects really made that scene just look fantastic, so I did enjoy that. The station is exploding in sections, however, and very slowly, so Ash is somehow still able to pilot the ship. Don't know how, but don't worry, because he's gonna die a moment later, making that final conversation that he has with Andy and Rain utterly irrelevant, and any of his misgivings completely pointless. He was gonna die no matter what, and he had no way of ever ensuring the outcome that he wanted. I'm really not sure why they had this scene. They just wanted to get more Ian Holmes in there, I guess. So at this moment, there's still about 25 minutes runtime left, so we know that we have to have the classic Aliens misdirection ending fake out before the final boss. We get a reconciliation scene between Rain and Andy, and she somehow changes Andy's prime directive just by saying it. Okay, I can't tell if this is a legit command or just a pleasant exchange between them. Either way, it's not good. So if she said just do what's best for Weyland-Yutani, that would be the prime directive? Andy would likely just choke her out in that moment, kill everyone else on board, and then pilot the ship straight back to Weyland-Yutani headquarters? Is this how directives work? Because before it had to be uploaded in a chip. And it sounded like there had to be some type of official writing process that would occur. I mean, Andy really just got Rook's directive in that last chip. So was Andy really just being like Rook? Like, how much are their personalities completely unique to their experiences? What does the chip do? Is it just credentials, firmware updates, personalities? Like, we just have no fucking idea. Pregananat girl then gives birth to baby cross black goo hybrid. The goo certainly takes longer time to work than the Xenos of this movie, but we get a new abomination both in-world and in writing that comes forth, and it doesn't melt through the ship because of coal power or something denser than the writers of this plot lays beneath them. The birth doesn't kill Pregananat either because, I guess, the goo, and because of the rapid metabolism powers, the baby is now a full adult in about 15 seconds, so goo again. The goo does burn through a part of the ship, however, so the autopilot turns off. Not sure why it would do that, but we need the ending to be even more epic and high stakes as possible. So we now have another movie that wants to introduce an additional alien species / variant, because it seems to be a legal requirement now. I mean, this one is about as contradictory as all the others, except now we have an alien-human hybrid with a tail that looks more like the Prometheus Navigator, because we have to try and link the stories up and balance out all the dog shit. The perfect organism now appears to be quite a bit slower than the original Xeno, so I'm not sure if making it 8 feet tall and skinny is much of a progression or an upgrade. So tall goo baby that's now goo adult has some type of Oedipal complex and sniffs around post Pregananat and then begins to, I don't know, I guess eat her? Not sure why. I mean, these perfect organisms don't need to eat, so what's it doing? I guess don't think about it. So adult Goo Baby then slices Andy and then attempts to kill Rain, but she gets away because Goo Baby is kinda slow and dumb. Ripley has now escaped into the galley room, and if you've been paying attention in the past 50 years, you will know that anytime there is an alien on board a spacecraft, an airlock scene is imminent. So you could probably tell Ripley 2.0 was going to do a 1.0 plus 2.0 and blow it out of the airlock maneuver. So she plans to eject the cargo container out into space, but she has to manually release 4 levers. Not sure why this is the case considering the ship has an autopilot, but I guess just for safety for some reason. We get a few more scenes of mucking about, and then Rain eventually kicks the goo onto the cargo floor, causing the entire system to go vacuum. But for way too long, like how much fucking air is in the cargo hold? Our perfect alien now appears to be getting shredded by something. I'm not sure what it is. I mean, is it space or is it the powder? Doesn't really look like anything, but it's disintegrating and trying to break into Rain's helmet with its little mouth snapper. Rain then yanks the cable in such a way that the cargo container detaches and the alien falls into space. We then get a very visually appetizing shot as we see the Romulus station in the background still exploding at the same time as the cargo container breaks and smashes into the rings. However, if the goo adult is anything like the Xenos, it won't have died and is just going to be chilling now until the next movie needs some plot motivation. We then see the final log with Rain saying that she'll fix Andy. I mean, this felt unnecessary as we proved earlier that androids' personalities can just be in those little SD cards, I guess, which you can remove. So I guess there never was really any real threat to Andy so long as she can salvage that brain chip. I did enjoy the last visual before the credits, and it does seem like they'll be setting up for some sequel, but who knows. Hopefully they'll do something completely different, devoid of all these issues. So overall, this movie was a bad story, really well executed. It looked visually impressive aside from Ash/Rook. The soundtrack was impactful and matching the tone of the other movies. The acting was all good, no one was too lackluster, and all delivered on their respective characters' motivations. The cinematography and style was a nice change from the previous entries. I enjoyed the lighting and camera choices throughout and felt that it was a nice departure from Ridley's entries into something a bit grittier. The editing was a bit rough in a few places, but nothing too bad. It didn't feel like it dragged in that many places, except for maybe the end, where we all knew the alien monster was going to get blown out the airlock, so there was effectively no tension. So it's been better than absolutely everything since Aliens in my mind, as I do feel like a lot of its mistakes were kind of unrelated to itself and really more related to what Ridley has done in his movies. There certainly were a lot of terrible ideas completely devoid of Ridley though. So what went wrong here? I mean, contrast it with the ideas of my last video about isolation, where you can see that the team Creative Assembly moved the ball forward in very small increments as opposed to huge leaps and bounds with radical innovations in a hope that the shock value of the new idea will be enough to sustain the experience. Isolation took the established rules of Alien and Aliens and just slightly widened the area of application. Romulus, however, is treading on new ground and there are a lot of missteps here. I mean, I understand that it's pretty much near impossible to appease all fans, and hardcore fans of any franchise usually prefer the original pieces of media over the new, as there's all kinds of nostalgia and personal sentiment attached. So I get that when franchises have new art, it's just not going to be well received as favorably when it's a radically new idea, especially when it's a linear narrative media type, such as you see in a movie or a game where multiple entries will be made over time that all have to connect to each other. Alien Isolation took the suspenseful intrigue of the first movie and all its best world-building qualities, like capturing that retro-futurism that we all loved, where things feel industrial, heavy, and utilitarian, packaged into a story-driven horror epic that continues the themes of the Aliens franchise. It actively helps bridge the stories by solving some of the logistical and timing problems between the first two films in a way that doesn't break any of the established events or ideas. Romulus, however, adds confusing inconsistencies into the timelines. We now have the idea that terraforming is super dangerous and overall not worth the efforts to colonize these new planets, which is in complete opposition to Aliens. We now have Weyland-Yutani now behaving like some futuristic feudal monarchy where all its subjects are simply serfs and slaves, which is a radical new idea that is not in line with what we've seen. I mean, Weyland-Yutani is not exactly philanthropic and they have very directed self-interested goals, but they are still a company that has some accountability. Otherwise, they wouldn't try and conceal any of their failings. We have the ideas of manual mining, even though all other relevant technology seems to be vastly superior than what we have now. We have the notion of a research facility that cannot communicate in a timely manner, even though at this point the delays in communications would have had to have been reduced. We have a station with a level of knowledge of the events of the first movie that they couldn't possibly have. We have the idea that synthetics can be upgraded to the point where they're essentially like brand new so long as they get a firmware upgrade. We have introduced the notion of engineering facehuggers outside of drones and queens. And we now have Prometheus black goo that is able to create useless tall alien hybrids. We also have new automatic assist weapons that the Colonial Marines don't have in Aliens for some reason. We have new weird gravity rules that we have not seen in any other entry that defy physics when it's convenient to the plot. We now have shown that Xenos really don't care about synthetics, which may or may not be a disaster later on, who knows. We have this idea of cryo, which seems to be readily available for space truckers in Alien, but not space miners in Romulus. but the biggest changes we have seen is we have utterly removed any time that needs to pass during the gestation and growth stages of the Xenos. That's all gone. The aliens seem to be really slow and dumb a lot of the time now as well, and stand around waiting for the plot to move forward before attacking. So there is a lot here that has not done great things for the franchise. I think this has continued the downward spiral of the Xenos' mystery and authenticity. There have just been too many bad additions to the xenomorphology type, and I feel like it's diluted the original. I think that Romulus has also shown that whilst it is nice to explore some different ideas regarding how to represent our character archetypes, that perhaps the super young angle wasn't the best. Maybe it's just how people looked in the 80s, authentic, textured, normal. Like Ripley and Lambert were good looking, but they're not so manicured to the point that they look like they've just come from a salon. It's interesting, because when I watched Alien when I was younger, I didn't think for 1 second about the age or appearance of any of the characters. But in Romulus, you can't help but feel like you're watching some school excursion gone wrong, or a dream sequence from one of the many reprehensible young adult series that you can torture yourself with from Netflix or whomever. The other big issue is the universe rules. I really wish people would start to clarify exactly how long it takes to communicate across the planets and different regions. I feel like Romulus's place in the timeline of all the movies allows the writers to just cherry pick the defense of their inconsistent writing by saying it has to do with the lack of evolution of specific technologies within the world that's not made clear to the audience. And I get that so many people who defend this movie just use the whole clandestine and secretive angle as a reason for lots of the criticism. And yeah, that's fine, but why didn't they put any of that shit in? If you want to justify your dodgy script by using a bunch of events and actions that happen off screen, then you make the audience aware of this, otherwise it's just a shit movie. We judge these medias based on the rules and ideas established in the canonical properties. It doesn't end well telling people to go read softcore porn fanfic to explain why some things work differently now. That's just horseshit. This is the problem when you are 45 years down the line technologically in film and media creation, and you now have the ability to do whatever you want visually. People just can't help but give their characters like jetpacks and stupid shit that looks good, because if you continually stimulate someone for 2 hours, maybe at the end they can't tell the difference between a good experience and a prolonged distraction. Overall, the plot was fairly boilerplate. That's not really a big criticism, because at this point, it's kind of proven to be the more effective delivery system for sequel narratives. When in doubt, retread the often trammeled ground. Every other story tried too hard to wax poetic about the eternal mortality of the human condition and our endless crusade for a divine creator or for immortality, or some retrospective analysis of how we are not so different from the Xenos, etc. ad nauseum. That trope has been done to death in sci-fi. The original Alien and Aliens were just basic stories about overcoming an unknown hostile threat or a rescue mission. The simple plot lines are easy to keep things balanced because the payoff doesn't need to be as grandiose. As we learned in Prometheus, finding out the origin story of the Xenos was about as satisfying as getting your prostate exfoliated with a weed whacker. It answered questions nobody wanted to know the answers to. So the plot of Romulus was basic, and for the first 30 to 40 minutes it was going alright, but then every sequence from that facehugger cryo scene to the end was littered with inconsistent and world-breaking bullshark that made the simple plot just look a bit farcical. There did also seem to be a fair amount of gratuitous violence in this. I think it's because Fade is notable for horror, he leaned a bit more into that than perhaps someone like Ridley would have. I don't think that's a bad choice inherently, but when it comes to horror, the more you see, the less afraid you are, so it's good to keep some of the violence out of focus. So I think this was an A- for effort for most of the people involved with this production, but the writers get an F, a big you done fucked it. They took all the best visual styles and sound direction from the first two movies, and all the plot and narrative devices from Resurrection and Prometheus. A well-meaning missed step that didn't quite live up to the expectations of the trailer. I do think, however, that this was the best movie made since Aliens, as there are so many qualities that it did do very well, despite the poor story. Perhaps a more ruthless producer could be used to turn out a movie even better on the next run, because quite a few of the problems within this movie were only a few tweaks or a couple of line insertions away from actually working. However, there was also a bunch of shit in here that needed to be completely removed also. Like, just for posterity, if I was to make some adjustments to this movie, I would get rid of the colony disease angle and get rid of Wayland being this cartoonish villain. I would have the young crew working there willingly because it pays well and because they want to travel to that Yzma system, and that's why they came to work in the mines. Have a prologue scene that outlines exactly how the station ended up in such a decrepit, abandoned state. Show someone during that initial station overrun scene put the whole place into like a cryo state as some type of quarantine measure before being killed, cooling the entire station down and allowing the xenomorphs to go into hibernation. Have our crew's motivation be driven by a Weyland-Yutani executive that reaches out to them and offers them an opportunity to go to the Yzma system if they're willing to go and check the Romulus station for some data and get some samples. You could have it so that later on you find out that Weyland deliberately chose them because they knew they could insulate themselves from their liability because the crew had already made it clear that they wanted off this mining colony to get to the Yzma system. Have Andy be given specific Romulus station credentials so he can navigate around effectively, but also have some type of hidden protocol that prioritizes the xenomorphs over the safety of the crew. Make it so when the crew does arrive, after they've deactivated the cryo, the xenomorphs all begin to wake up, including the facehuggers and the drones, and possibly even a queen. You could really just have the remainder of the movie be about them trying to escape from this. I would alter the immortality cure angle and slightly tweak it. Have the company be researching ways that they could enhance the human conditions so the miners could work longer hours. That is, if you are going to keep the stupid mining angle as well as how dumb the overall goo angle is. Have the design of the Romulus station be more compartmentalized, allowing them to have proper shootouts with the Xenos and to not be concerned about the consequences of spilling the aliens' acid blood. That would be a really interesting way to have a dynamic environment that's reactive to our characters' behaviors. Have the Xenomorphs still treat Synthetics and Andy like they were human beings, the only difference being when they get them back to the hive, they can't actually effectively impregnate them. I think that would actually open up some interesting counterplay between the Xenos and the Synthetics. Have the entire station collision countdown plot be motivated by the characters' actions. Have the crew deliberately set a self-destruct sequence on the station in an attempt to eradicate all the Xenos. Follow the ideas of the second aliens and have a vent scene in there somewhere. Have the crew running around this labyrinth of air conditioning units as they try and make their way outside onto the surface of the station. Have the Xenos and the Queens pursuing them atop the station as it begins to crash into the rings. Make the reason that Weyland-Yutani has an alien in the first place is because of the events of alien isolation. Say that Samuels managed to sneak out an egg on Sevastopol with a Wei-Yu beacon attached to it before he died. I mean, that's just a few ideas I've come up with quickly. I'm sure there's holes and issues, but I still think they make more sense than what we got, and that's really the point. I feel like I've seen so many people provide explanation for things that would have been acceptable in defense of this movie, but none of those things were put in it. So the writers did not think long and hard enough about their choices, as I feel like most Aliens fans could come up with a half-decent story without violating the rules if they had some time and actually cared. So it's a 5 to 6 out of 10. I would still rewatch it again, which is more than I can say for all the others save Alien and Aliens. So it is still worth watching if you are a fan, as it is Alien content nonetheless. I really hope we can get a movie with Hicks and Ripley about what would have happened post-Aliens and just de-canonize all the other movies, like 3 and Resurrection, and just call those other ones Dreams or Synths or some other shit, because we've only got so much time left to correct some of those blunders before we just get every actor looking like Ash after they've already passed on. So yeah, that's it. Go give it a watch.